Sometimes the deepest shadows are cast not by malice, but by a single, misplaced act of kindness, an act you replay in your mind for 70 years until you can no longer tell where the light ended and the darkness began. My name is Judith, and I am 82 years old. From the porch of this old farmhouse, the one my grandfather built with his own hands, I can see the same rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania that I've seen my entire life. The world has spun on. Satellites crisscross a sky that once only held birds and biplanes, and yet, out here, the seasons still turn with the same slow, deliberate grace. But the peace is a fragile thing. It's a quilt stitched over a history that still stirs in the quiet of the night, a story I've held locked in my heart, too heavy and too terrible to share. Until now. The story begins in the 50s, in the long exhale after the world had held its breath through the war. America was looking forward, all shiny chrome and bright futures, but in the forgotten pockets of the countryside, the past was a recent ghost. The war had taken my father, James. That's what they told us. He was listed as missing in action, somewhere in the chaos of the European theater. My mother, a woman hollowed out by a grief that had no grave to visit, never accepted it. She kept his seat at the dinner table and spoke of him in the present tense, as if he'd simply stepped out to the barn and would be back any minute. We lived a life of quiet survival on our farm, miles from the nearest town. It was just my mother and me. She was worn thin by work and sorrow, her silence is heavier than any lecture. And I was a girl of 14, old enough to understand loss, but too young to grasp its true permanence. I was caught in the strange space between the childhood my father's presence had colored and the stark, demanding reality of a future without him. Our days were measured by the needs of the land and the animals, milking the cows before dawn, mending fences in the biting wind, tilling soil that was stubborn and rocky but honest. We didn't have much, but we had our routine, our land, and the shared, unspoken hope that one day a letter would arrive or a car would turn up our long gravel driveway and my father would step out, finally home. That winter was particularly harsh. The snow started early and fell with a vengeance, burying our fields under a thick white blanket that muffled the world into a profound silence. It was a beautiful and isolating time. The roads were often impassable, cutting us off from what little society we had. We were an island in a sea of white. It was on just such a day, with the wind howling a mournful tune around the eaves of the house, that our quiet world was shattered by a sound it was never meant to hear. It wasn't the familiar crack of a frozen tree branch giving way. It was a violent, metallic scream, a tortured shriek of twisting steel that ripped through the muffled quiet of the snowstorm. It was followed by a sickening, final thud that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. My mother and I froze in the kitchen, a half-peeled potato slipping from her hand and landing softly on the floor. We looked at each other, our eyes wide with a question that needed no words. Nothing ever happened out here. No one used the old county road that bordered our property in a storm like this, unless they were lost or desperate. "Stay here," my mother commanded, her voice tight with alarm. She wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the heavy coat hanging by the door. But I couldn't stay put. A morbid curiosity, a feeling that something significant had just breached our lonely existence, pulled me after her. "I'm coming with you," I said, my voice more determined than I felt. I was already pulling on my boots, my heart hammering against my ribs. She didn't argue, perhaps knowing it was useless, or perhaps feeling that in the face of the unknown, two were better than one. We stepped out into the blizzard. The wind tore at us, stinging our faces with ice and snow. The visibility was barely a few yards. We followed the sound, trudging through knee-deep drifts towards the bend in the road where the noise had come from. It was a struggle, every step a battle against the elements. The silence had returned, now more ominous than peaceful. It was as if the storm itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what we would find. And then we saw it. A dark shape, a gash in the otherwise pristine white landscape. A car, an unfamiliar model, had skidded off the road and slammed head-on into the thick trunk of an ancient oak tree that stood like a sentinel on our property line. The front of the car was crumpled like a discarded piece of paper. Steam hissed from the mangled engine, rising into the frigid air like a departing soul. My mother stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Dear Lord," she whispered. My own breath caught in my throat. In all my years, I had never seen such a thing. Cars were a part of the distant town, not a broken, smoking wreck in our woods. We approached cautiously, the crunch of our boots on the snow sounding unnaturally loud. There was no movement from inside the vehicle. The driver's side door was jammed shut, bent into a horrifying new shape. The windshield was a spiderweb of shattered glass. I peered through a clear patch and saw a figure slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. "Is he—" I couldn't finish the sentence. My mother, summoning a strength I hadn't seen in her since before my father left, moved to the passenger side. The door was miraculously undamaged. She pulled on the handle, and with a groan of protesting metal, it opened. A faint smell of gasoline and something else, something metallic and warm, drifted out. Inside, the man was unconscious. He was dressed in a fine, dark coat, clothes that were clearly not meant for our rough, rural world. There was a deep gash on his forehead, and blood was matting his hair, a stark, shocking crimson against the snow that had blown in through the broken window. "We have to get him out," my mother said, her voice regaining its practical, no-nonsense tone. It was the voice she used when a calf was sick or a storm was coming. It was the voice of survival. Together, with a strength born of adrenaline and fear, we managed to pull the man from the car. He was heavy, a dead weight in our arms. We half-dragged, half-carried him back towards the house, a grueling journey through the deepening snow. The wind howled around us, trying to steal the last of our strength, but we pushed on, driven by the primal instinct to save a life. We brought him into the warmth of the kitchen and laid him on the rug in front of the hearth. He was still unconscious. My mother, who had been a volunteer nurse's aide before she married, went to work with a quiet efficiency. She sent me for the first aid kit, for warm water, for clean rags. As she gently cleaned the blood from his face, I saw him clearly for the first time. He was not old, perhaps in his 30s. There was a certain refinement to his features, a stark contrast to the rugged, weather-beaten faces of the farmers I knew. As my mother tended to the gash on his head, his wallet fell from the inside pocket of his coat. I picked it up. It was made of fine leather. Inside, there was a sheaf of American dollars, more money than I had ever seen in one place. But there were no papers, no driver's license, no identification of any kind. Just the money and a small, folded photograph of a European-looking city I didn't recognize. The man stirred, groaning softly. His eyes fluttered open. They were a startling shade, and for a moment they were filled with a wild animal panic. He tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "Easy now," my mother said softly. "You've been in an accident." He looked from my mother to me, his gaze sharp and assessing, even through the fog of pain. Where am I?" he asked. His English was perfect, but it was layered with a thick, unmistakable German accent. "You're in our home," I replied, finding my voice. "You crashed your car on the county road." He seemed to process this slowly. He looked down at his leg, which was twisted at an unnatural angle. A fresh wave of pain washed over his face. "My leg," he gasped. "I think it is broken." "We need to call the sheriff," my mother said, standing up, "and get Dr. Adams out here." At the mention of the sheriff, a profound and immediate change came over the man. The pain in his eyes was replaced by sheer terror. "No," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. He grabbed my mother's arm with surprising strength. No police, please, I beg of you. My mother looked down at his hand on her arm, her expression unreadable. Why not? You're hurt. You need a doctor. I am a doctor, he said, his breathing ragged. I know the leg is broken, but please, no authorities. They will not understand. I have problems with my papers. I am on my way to Canada to start a new life. If they find me, they will send me back to Germany. He looked at us, his eyes pleading. Please, I have money. I can pay you for your trouble. Just let me stay here for a few days until I am strong enough to move on. Please. My mother hesitated. In our small, insulated world, the law was a distant but respected concept. Hiding someone from the sheriff was unthinkable. It was a line you did not cross. I could see the conflict warring in her face. The instinct of a good citizen versus the compassion for a fellow human being, injured and terrified on her kitchen floor. He turned his desperate gaze to me. Please, he whispered, looking directly at me. I am just a man trying to escape the past. Your country. It is the land of second chances, is it not? It was that plea, that appeal to the ideals I'd only read about in schoolbooks, that tipped the scale for me. He looked so helpless, so desperate. In my naive, 14-year-old heart, I saw a victim of the same war that had taken my father, a man trying to outrun the ghosts of a shattered Europe. We should help him, Mom, I said softly. It's what Dad would do. Mentioning my father was a calculated risk. It could either harden her resolve or soften it. I saw her shoulders slump, the fight going out of her. She looked at the man on the floor, then back at me, and in her tired eyes I saw a flicker of the woman she used to be, a woman who believed in kindness above all else. We'll move him to the spare room, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But just until the storm passes and he can think of a better plan. And Judith, she added, her voice hardening, not a word of this to anyone. You understand? No one. I nodded, a thrill of conspiracy and importance running through me. I was a keeper of a great secret. I was helping to save a man's life. His name, he told us, was Kurt. Over the next few days, as the blizzard continued to rage outside, our farmhouse became a makeshift hospital and a sanctuary. My mother used her limited knowledge to set his leg as best she could, fashioning a splint from pieces of wood from the kindling box and strips of an old bedsheet. Kurt, despite his pain, directed her, his voice calm and professional. He truly did seem to be a doctor. We hid his car as best we could, shoveling snow over it until it was just another anonymous drift by the side of the road, hoping no one would notice it until we could figure out what to do. I became his primary caretaker. I brought him his meals, changed the dressings on his head wound, and sat with him for hours, listening to his stories. He was a captivating storyteller. He spoke of Vienna, of grand concert halls and universities, of a life of culture and learning that seemed a universe away from my own. He talked about his medical studies, his passion for science and healing. To be a doctor, he told me one afternoon, his gaze distant, is to hold a sacred trust, to mend what is broken. That is all I have ever wanted to do. I hung on his every word. He was the most interesting person I had ever met. He didn't treat me like a child, as most adults did. He spoke to me as an equal, asking me about my dreams, about the books I read. He saw a spark in me that no one else had ever bothered to look for. You have a healer's hands, he commented once as I was carefully rewrapping the bandage on his forehead. You are gentle and precise. You could be a great nurse, maybe even a doctor yourself one day. No one had ever suggested such a thing. A girl from a farm? A doctor? It was an impossible, thrilling thought. He was opening up a world of possibilities I had never dared to imagine. I found myself making excuses to be in his room, drawn to his intelligence and his worldly charm. I was too young and too naive to see the subtle calculations behind his eyes, to understand the artful way he was weaving a web of gratitude and dependence around me. One evening, he asked me about my father. "Your mother," he said, "she speaks of her husband as if he is still alive." "We don't know for sure," I said, repeating the fragile hope we lived by. "He's missing." "Ah, the war," Kurt sighed, a shadow passing over his face. "It took so much from so many." "What did your father do in the army?" "He was just a regular soldier," I said, "an infantryman. He sent us a few things from Europe, little souvenirs." I remembered an old wooden box where my mother kept these treasures. On an impulse, wanting to share a piece of my father with this man who seemed to understand so much, I went and got it. I brought the box to his bedside and opened it. Inside were a few postcards, a German coin, and a small embroidered patch my father had taken from a captured enemy uniform. It wasn't a swastika or anything overtly sinister, just an insignia with a strange bird and some letters I couldn't read. I handed it to Kurt. "He sent this from Germany not long before we stopped getting letters." He took the patch from me, his long fingers turning it over. For a moment, his expression became unreadable, his eyes hardening into something I didn't recognize. It was a cold, flat look, devoid of the warmth and kindness he had shown me. The change was so sudden and so complete that it startled me. He stared at the patch for a long time, his jaw tight. "What is it?" I asked, a little nervously. "Do you know what it means?" He blinked, and just as quickly as it had appeared, the coldness was gone, replaced by a sad, weary smile. "It is nothing," he said, handing the patch back to me. "Just a reminder of a dark time for my country, a time of great foolishness. Your father was a brave man to fight against it." But I couldn't shake the feeling of what I had seen. It was like a mask had slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing something chilling underneath. It was the first dissonant note in the beautiful symphony of his stories, the first hint that the man we were sheltering was far more complex and perhaps far more dangerous than the helpless victim we believed him to be. I pushed the feeling down, telling myself I had imagined it, that it was just a painful memory for him. I wanted to believe in the kind, brilliant doctor, the man who saw a future for me I couldn't see for myself. I didn't know then that my youthful compassion wasn't saving a life, it was feeding a monster. And that monster, having found its way into the warmth of our home, was only just beginning to study the family that had given him refuge. The image of his face in that moment, when he held my father's war souvenir, became a ghost that lingered in the corners of my mind. It was a fleeting thing, a brief crack in a carefully constructed facade, but it was enough to plant a seed of unease. I tried to reason it away, telling myself that, of course, a German man would be haunted by the symbols of a war that had destroyed his homeland. His sadness, I reasoned, was simply a different shade of the grief my mother wore every single day. I chose to believe in the kind, worldly doctor, the man who spoke of healing and second chances, because the alternative, that we had welcomed a darker truth into our home, was too terrifying to contemplate. For a 14-year-old girl living a life of monotonous chores and unspoken sorrow, Kurt was a flicker of something different, something more, and I wasn't ready to let that light go out. The days that followed were thick with a tension that felt woven into the very air of the farmhouse. The blizzard eventually subsided, leaving behind a world of pristine, sculpted snow that glittered under a cold, bright sun. The roads were cleared, and the world began to move again. The mailman's truck reappeared on our road, the familiar rattle of its engine now a sound of pure dread. The first time we heard it approaching, a silent panic erupted in our small kitchen. My mother shot me a look, and I flew to Kurt's room, closing the door with a soft click, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. We held our breath as the truck stopped at our mailbox, and didn't exhale until we heard it drive away. It was a stark reminder of our new reality. Our home was no longer a sanctuary, but a prison of our own making, and we were wardens to a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. Kurt's leg was healing, but his recovery was a slow, agonizing process. He claimed he needed weeks more of immobility, and we had no choice but to believe him. He was a doctor, after all. He knew best. And so, the routine of our deception solidified. I would sneak extra portions of food from the pantry, hiding bread and canned goods in my apron to take to his room, always terrified my mother would notice the dwindling supplies. The lie became a constant weight on my tongue. When the pastor's wife called on the telephone to ask why we hadn't been at Sunday service, my mother fabricated a story about a bad flu that had swept through our house, her voice unnaturally high and brittle. I stood beside her, listening, feeling like a co-conspirator in a crime I didn't fully understand. We were good people, we were honest people, but we were lying to everyone, isolating ourselves further, all for the stranger in our spare room. He, meanwhile, seemed to grow more comfortable, more settled. His pain subsided into a manageable ache, and his charm and intellect began to fill the small room he occupied. He became my tutor, my mentor. He would look over my schoolwork in the evenings, explaining algebra with a clarity my own teacher lacked. He'd point out the fallacies in a history text, offering his own first-hand perspectives on the complexities of European politics, making the dry words on the page come alive. "History is not a set of facts, Judith," he would say, tapping a page with a long finger. "It is a story, written by the victors. To truly understand it, you must learn to read the silences, the things that are not said." His words were intoxicating. They made me feel intelligent, sophisticated. He was arming me with a new way of seeing the world, a cynical wisdom that made my rural life feel small and simple-minded. He subtly began to drive a wedge between me and my mother. He would listen patiently as I vented my frustrations about her constant sadness, her strict rules, her refusal to look to the future. "She is a woman trapped by her grief," Kurt would say with a sympathetic sigh. "She cannot see you for the remarkable young woman you are becoming. Her pain blinds her, but I see it. I see your potential." He made our secret feel like a special bond, a pact that only we could understand. "Your mother has a farmer's pragmatism," he told me once. "She helped me out of a sense of duty. But you helped me out of a sense of true compassion. You have a much larger heart, Judith, and a much stronger mind." I drank in his praise like a parched traveler finding water. He was validating a part of me I didn't even know existed, the part that yearned to be seen as more than just a farmer's daughter. The inevitable crisis arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the accident. It came in the form of Sheriff Henderson's patrol car rolling slowly up our driveway. My stomach plummeted to my feet. The sheriff rarely came out our way unless someone was dead or in serious trouble. My mother saw the car from the kitchen window, and the color drained from her face. "Get to his room, keep him quiet," she hissed, already composing her face into a mask of weary neutrality. "Don't make a sound." I flew down the hallway, my socked feet silent on the wooden floorboards. I slipped into Kurt's room, my finger to my lips. He was sitting up in bed, reading one of my father's old books. He had already heard the car. His face was tense, his eyes alert and sharp, like a cornered animal. The air in the room was suddenly electric with fear. We heard the heavy crunch of boots on the porch, then a firm knock on the door. My world shrank to the size of that small room, to the sound of my own ragged breathing and the frantic beat of my heart. I could hear the low murmur of voices from the front of the house, my mother's and the sheriff's. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was casual, neighborly. It was an agonizing performance. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear. "Found that wreck down at the bend of the old county road," Sheriff Henderson was saying. "Figured it must have happened during the blizzard. Things pretty well buried, but one of the Miller boys spotted the tail end of it. Ran the plates. Belongs to a fellow out of New York City. A rental. Car was reported stolen 2 days before the storm." My blood ran cold. Stolen. Kurt had never mentioned that. "We haven't found any sign of the driver," the sheriff continued. "No tracks, no body. Figure he must have stumbled off and either got a ride or he's out there somewhere in the snow. Just wanted to ask if you saw or heard anything unusual that night." I could picture my mother standing there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from shaking. "It was a terrible storm, Sheriff," she said, her voice amazingly steady. "The wind was so loud, you could barely hear yourself think. We didn't hear a thing until it was all over." "I see," the sheriff said. I could hear the doubt in his voice, or maybe I was just projecting my own terror onto it. "Well, if you do remember anything, you give me a call. It's a strange business. Man steals a car, drives it all the way out to the middle of nowhere, and then just vanishes." "We will, Sheriff. Thank you for stopping by." We heard the door close, the boots crunch back across the porch, and the engine of the patrol car start up. Only when the sound had faded completely into the distance did I dare to breathe. I turned to Kurt. He was sitting perfectly still, his knuckles white where he gripped the book. "The car was stolen?" I whispered, the accusation clear in my voice. He finally looked at me, and his expression was not one of fear, but of profound disappointment, as if I had failed some crucial test. "Judith," he said, his voice soft and laced with hurt. "Did you really think I was a common criminal?" "But the sheriff said it was reported stolen," he interrupted gently. "The man I rented it from was a swindler. I paid him in cash, and he took my money and reported the car stolen to collect the insurance. I discovered his deception too late. This is why I cannot go to the police. It is my word against his, and I am a foreigner with no papers. Who do you think they would believe?" His explanation was so plausible, so perfectly crafted to play on my sympathies, that I felt a hot flush of shame. Of course, it made perfect sense. I was a fool to have doubted him. "I'm sorry," I mumbled. "I was just scared." "We were all scared," he said, his warm smile returning. "But you see what we are up against. We must be clever. We must trust each other, you and I. We are in this together." That night, the conversation with the sheriff ignited my mother's dormant fears. When I came out to the kitchen for a glass of milk before bed, I found her sitting at the table in the dark, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. "He has to leave, Judith," she said, without preamble. Her voice was flat, resolute. "He can't," I protested. "His leg isn't healed." "And where would he go?" "That is not our concern anymore," she said, turning to face me. "This is more than just helping a man in need. A stolen car, police. These are things we should not have in our lives. There is a darkness around that man. I feel it." "You're just scared," I shot back, parroting Kurt's own words. "He explained about the car. He's the victim." "Is he?" my mother asked, her gaze piercing. "Or is he just a very good liar? I watch the way he looks at you. The way he talks to you. He is filling your head with ideas, Judith, making you think you're a part of some grand, secret adventure. This is not an adventure. This is dangerous. He has been here too long. I want him gone by the end of the week." "No," I said, my voice rising. "That's cruel. We can't just throw him out in the snow to die." "I don't know what we've brought into this house," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "But it is not a blessing. Your father was a good man. He helped people, yes, but he was not a fool. He would see the danger in this." We argued for nearly an hour, our whispers sharp and angry in the quiet house. It was the first time I had ever truly defied my mother. I defended Kurt with a passion that surprised even myself, using the logic and arguments he had armed me with. In the end, I wore her down. She didn't agree, but she retreated into a weary, resentful silence, and I knew I had won. I had chosen the word of a stranger over the intuition of my own mother. As I lay in bed that night, a sliver of guilt wormed its way into my heart, but I crushed it. My mother didn't understand. She couldn't see Kurt the way I did. A few nights later, my conviction was tested again. Kurt developed a fever, his temperature soared, and he became delirious. My mother, despite her misgivings, couldn't stand by and watch a man suffer. She instructed me on how to bring the fever down with cool cloths and aspirin. I sat by his bedside all night, wiping his brow as he tossed and turned, tangled in his sheets. It was in the deepest hour of the night, with a winter moon casting long shadows across the floor, that he began to talk in his sleep. He spoke entirely in German, a language I did not understand. But you don't need to understand the words to recognize the tone. This was not the gentle, cultured voice of the man who discussed history and poetry with me. This was a different voice entirely. It was harsh, guttural, authoritative. It was the voice of a man giving orders, cold, clipped, and utterly devoid of compassion. He would bark out phrases, then fall silent for a moment before starting again. Over and over I heard a specific word, a number it sounded like, repeated with a chilling, impatient cadence. 49, 49. Then other words, sharp and ugly, that sounded like curses. I sat there in the dark, a cold dread seeping into me. I felt like I was listening to a complete stranger, a man I had never met. Who was this person? Who was the man who hid behind the kind eyes and the charming stories? The fever broke just before dawn. He woke up, his mind clear, weak but lucid. He saw the look on my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice raspy. You were talking in your sleep," I stammered. "In German." He managed a weak smile. "Ah, the mother tongue. It returns in our dreams and our fevers. Did I say anything interesting?" "I don't know," I lied. "I couldn't understand." "Probably for the best," he sighed, closing his eyes. "The mind dredges up all sorts of nonsense from the past when it is sick. Forget you heard it. It was meaningless." I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe that the cruel voice I'd heard was just a meaningless phantom of the fever. But I couldn't forget the tone. I couldn't forget the cold command that had resonated in that room. It was another crack in the facade, wider and more disturbing than the first. My loyalty was beginning to war with my fear. The next morning, my mother found me staring out the kitchen window, lost in thought. She came and stood beside me, and for a moment we watched the winter birds at the feeder in silence. "He's getting stronger," she said quietly. "It will be time for him to go soon." It wasn't a question or a demand, just a statement of fact. Before I could answer, Kurt's voice called out from his room. "Judith, could you come in here for a moment?" I gave my mother a hesitant look and went to him. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, testing his weight on his splinted leg. He looked up at me, his expression serious. "My leg is much improved," he announced. "I believe I will be able to travel in a few more days." A strange mix of relief and disappointment washed over me. "But," he continued, his eyes locking onto mine, "before I can leave, there is one thing I must do. One thing that only you can help me with. It is a matter of life and death. My life. And I must ask you to be braver than you have ever been before." I stood there, frozen in the doorway of his room, the scent of antiseptic and old books suddenly feeling suffocating. His words hung in the air, heavy with a significance that I could feel in the pit of my stomach. a matter of life and death. My life. For weeks I had been his nurse, his confidant, his student. Now he was asking me to be his soldier. A part of me, the young, naive part that craved importance, felt a thrill. He was trusting me, and only me. But a deeper, colder part of me recoiled. This was a new threshold, a line I instinctively knew I should not cross. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you need me to do?" He gestured for me to come closer, to sit on the small wooden chair I always used when I visited him. He leaned forward, his expression grave, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Before the crash," he began, "I knew something was wrong. For miles, I had the feeling I was being followed. A dark sedan, keeping its distance, but always there. I was not just a man with paper problems, Judith. I was a man carrying sensitive information that certain people back in Germany, people who resent those who did not conform, would do anything to get back." He painted a picture of a thrilling, terrifying escape across Europe and the Atlantic, a narrative of spies and secrets that made my farm girl existence seem impossibly dull. The documents for my new life, my credentials, research papers, everything that proves who I am and what I know is in a briefcase. When I realized the car behind me was closing in, I knew I couldn't risk letting them catch me with it. I pulled over, pretending to have engine trouble. I took the briefcase and hid it just off the road in the woods. My plan was to lead them on a chase, then double back for it later. But the storm worsened, the roads became ice, and, well, you know the rest. "You want me to go get it?" I asked, my heart beginning to hammer. "I have no one else to ask," he said, his eyes pleading. "The sheriff has seen the car. His men have probably searched the area around it, but they would not have looked further. They would not have known where to look." He reached under his pillow and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a map, crudely drawn in pencil, showing the bend in the road, the old oak tree, and then a trail leading into the woods, marked by landmarks I recognized, the split boulder, the cluster of birch trees. An X was marked, about a half-mile deep into our property. "It is in a hollow log, protected from the snow," he explained. "No one would ever find it by accident. But you must not be seen, Judith. If anyone sees you, if anyone asks what you are doing, the entire plan is compromised. My life is in your hands." The weight of his words was immense, a physical pressure on my shoulders. He wasn't just asking for a favor, he was anointing me, his savior. How could I say no? To refuse would be to condemn him. To agree would be to step deeper into his world of shadows and lies, a world that was beginning to feel more real than my own. "My mother will never let me go," I said, the practical obstacle feeling like a flimsy shield. "You are a clever girl," Kurt said smoothly, a flicker of a confident smile on his lips. "You will think of something. For me." The next morning, I stood before my mother in the kitchen, my lie prepared. It felt clumsy and foreign on my tongue. "The snow took down part of the fence line over by the north pasture," I said, avoiding her gaze by busying myself with packing a small lunch of a sandwich and an apple. "I should go check on it before any of the cows wander off." She stopped her kneading of bread dough and looked at me, her hands white with flour. A long, silent moment passed between us. Her eyes searched my face, and I felt as though she could see right through my flimsy excuse to the terrifying truth beneath. "That's a long walk in this snow," she said, her tone even. "It can wait another day." "No, it can't," I insisted, my voice sharper than I intended. "It's my job. Dad always said to fix a fence the moment you see it's down." Using my father against her felt like a special kind of betrayal, but it was the most powerful weapon I had. I saw her flinch. "Take the shotgun then," she said, turning back to her dough, her shoulders stiff. "For coyotes." "I'll be fine," I said, already pulling on my heavy coat and boots. "I won't be long." I didn't look back as I left the house. I couldn't bear to see the worry and suspicion in her eyes. The cold air hit me like a slap, a welcome shock after the suffocating tension of the kitchen. With Kurt's map tucked into my pocket, I set off, not towards the north pasture, but towards the woods bordering the old county road. The world was a vast, silent expanse of white. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of my boots in the snow and the ragged puff of my own breath in the frigid air. The forest, usually a place of comfort and familiarity, felt alien and menacing. The trees stood like silent, judgmental witnesses, their bare branches clawing at a pale, indifferent sky. Every snap of a twig under the weight of snow made me jump. Every dark shadow seemed to hold a watching presence. I was terrified, but I was also filled with a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. I was Judith, the farm girl, on a secret mission. I was saving a man's life. It took me nearly an hour to reach the area Kurt had marked. I found the split boulder and the cluster of birch trees easily enough. From there, I followed his directions, counting my paces, pushing through low-hanging, snow-laden branches that showered me with ice. Finally, I saw it. A massive, fallen log, half buried in a snowdrift. My heart leaped. I fell to my knees, my hands raw with cold, and began digging away the snow from the hollowed-out opening. And there it was. A dark leather briefcase, cold and damp to the touch. It was heavier than I expected. I pulled it out and brushed off the snow, my mission complete. I had done it. I sat back on my heels, breathing heavily, a wave of relief washing over me, but it was quickly followed by another, more powerful emotion. Curiosity. What was in this case that was so important? What secrets did it hold? "Everything that proves who I am," he had said. I ran my numb fingers over the brass latches. The thought of opening it felt like a profound betrayal of his trust. But the memory of his cold eyes, the sound of his cruel, fevered voice, these things warred with my sense of loyalty. I had a right to know. I was risking everything for him. I deserved to know who I was risking it for. My decision made, I fumbled with the latches. They were locked. Of course, they were locked. Frustration and disappointment soured my relief. I ran my hands over the case, searching for any other way in. On the side, tucked into a small leather loop, was a luggage tag, a simple cardboard rectangle in a celluloid sleeve, meant for an address. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling so much I could barely get a grip on it. The tag was mostly blank. But on the line, designated for a name, written in a sharp, precise, and unfamiliar hand, was a name. It was not Kurt. It was two words that meant nothing to me, yet they sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Dr. Frederick Miller. I stared at the name, my mind racing. Who was Frederick Miller? Why was his name on Kurt's briefcase? Was it an alias? A colleague? Was Kurt's real name Frederick Miller? Every possibility felt sinister. It was a concrete piece of evidence, the first tangible proof that his story was not the whole truth. It was a lie, written in black ink. I shoved the tag back into its sleeve and clutched the briefcase to my chest. The journey back to the farmhouse was a blur of fear. The woods no longer felt menacing. They felt indifferent. The real danger was not out here among the trees. The real danger was waiting for me back at the house, sitting in the spare room, pretending to be my friend. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, as if the briefcase was not just filled with papers, but with the weight of a terrible, unknown truth. I was no longer a brave heroine on a secret mission. I was a fool, a pawn in a game whose rules I didn't know, and I was walking willingly back to the most dangerous player. When I slipped back into the house, my mother was nowhere to be seen. I was grateful for the small mercy. I went straight to Kurt's room, my face flushed from the cold and my heart pounding from fear. He was waiting, his posture tense with anticipation. When he saw the briefcase in my hands, an expression of profound relief washed over his face. "Judith," he breathed, reaching for it. "You did it. I knew you could." I handed it to him, my hands shaking. He laid it on the bed, his fingers tracing its outline as if greeting a long-lost friend. He produced a small key from his pocket and unlocked the latches with a satisfying double click. He opened the lid just a crack, peered inside, and then shut it again, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. "You have saved my life," he said, looking up at me. His eyes were shining with gratitude, and for a moment I almost forgot the name on the tag. I almost fell back under his spell. But I had to know. "I saw the tag," I said, my voice small but firm. "On the side, it said Frederick Miller." The warmth in his eyes vanished, extinguished as quickly as a candle flame in a breeze. That now familiar coldness settled in its place. He didn't look angry or scared. He looked appraising. As if he was reevaluating me, recalculating my place in his plans. He gave a small, weary sigh. "I had hoped you would not see that," he said. "It complicates things." "Who is Frederick Miller?" I pressed, emboldened by his calm. "Frederick Miller is the man I hope to become," he said smoothly, his story already prepared. "It is the name on my new documents, my new identity. In a few weeks, once I am in Canada, Kurt will cease to exist. I will be reborn as Dr. Miller, a man with no past. A man who is free." He looked at me, a sad smile playing on his lips. "It is a necessary deception, Judith, to protect myself. And now, to protect you. Because now you know. You are a part of my secret now, in a way you were not before." His words were meant to be a comfort, an inclusion into an inner circle. But they felt like a cage. He was telling me that my knowledge of this lie bound me to him. I was no longer just a helper. I was a true accomplice. "You understand why this must remain our secret, don't you?" he continued, his voice soft, almost hypnotic. "If your mother knew, if anyone knew, it would put us all in grave danger. But I trust you, Judith. I have trusted you with my life, and now I am trusting you with my future." I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. He had an explanation for everything, an answer for every question, a soothing word for every doubt. But the doubt was no longer a seed. It was a cold, thorny vine wrapping itself around my heart. I had seen the name, and I had seen the shift in his eyes when I mentioned it. No matter what he said, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I had just retrieved a briefcase full of lies for a man who was not who he claimed to be. I excused myself and fled to my room, closing the door behind me. I leaned against it, my body trembling. I had crossed a line. I had lied to my mother. I had trespassed on my own land in service of a secret, and I had become entangled in a web of deception I couldn't begin to understand. As I looked at my reflection in the small mirror on my dresser, I saw a stranger. The innocent farm girl was gone. In her place was a girl with old, frightened eyes, a girl who was beginning to understand that some secrets don't just protect a life, they have the power to consume one. The door to my bedroom, once a simple barrier against the outside world, now felt like the gate to a prison cell. I was the sole inmate, locked in with the terrible knowledge that I was accomplice to a man of profound deception. The name on that luggage tag, Dr. Frederick Miller, was a ghost that haunted my every waking thought. It was proof, tangible and terrifying, that the foundation of trust upon which I had built the last few weeks of my life was a lie. My loyalty to Kurt, which had once felt so noble and brave, now felt like a sickness in my soul. I was isolated completely. I couldn't turn to my mother, for I had chosen to defy her intuition and betray her trust. And I was now more afraid of Kurt than I had ever been of the consequences of hiding him. I was trapped between a mother I was lying to and a stranger I could not trust. With the return of his briefcase, a subtle but significant shift occurred in the dynamic of our house. Kurt's performance of the grateful, helpless victim began to fade, replaced by a quiet, confident authority. The pain in his leg was clearly subsiding. He began to move around the room with more ease, and with this returning strength, his true nature seemed to emerge from the shadows. The charm was still there, a tool he wielded with expert precision, but it was now threaded with something harder, something colder. He was no longer just a guest recovering in our spare room. He was an occupying force, and I was his sole captive subject. His lessons continued, but their focus changed. He was less interested in my schoolwork and more interested in me. He began to ask probing, meticulous questions about our town, our neighbors, the local economy. He was especially interested in my father. "Tell me more about your father's time in the war," he'd say, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp and focused. "What kind of man was he? Strong-willed? Stubborn?" "He was a good man," I would reply, feeling a defensive loyalty rise in me. "He was kind and he worked hard." Of course, Kurt would say soothingly. "But I am interested in his mind, in his resilience. Did he break under pressure? Did he have fears?" His questions felt clinical, like he wasn't asking about a person, but studying a specimen. He was dissecting my father, my family, my life, piece by piece, and filing the information away for some unknown purpose. I would give him vague, non-committal answers, but this only seemed to intrigue him more. My reticence was a challenge, another variable in his quiet, constant analysis. He started to play cruel psychological games, testing my loyalty, confirming his control over me. One afternoon, I entered his room to bring him a fresh glass of water and found the briefcase lying on his bed, not just unlocked, but slightly ajar. A corner of a manila folder was visible. It was a deliberate invitation, a silent dare. I froze in the doorway, my heart pounding. He was in the small washroom connected to the bedroom. I could hear him humming softly. It would take me only a second to look. Just 1 second to find out what other names, what other lies were hidden inside. But I couldn't do it. I was paralyzed by fear. Not the fear of being caught, but the fear of what he would do if he knew I had looked. It felt like another of his tests, and I knew instinctively that the only way to pass was to fail, to refuse to play. I placed the water on his bedside table, turned, and walked out, closing the door softly behind me. A few minutes later, he called me back in. The briefcase was now closed and locked, back in its spot under the bed. "Thank you for the water, Judith," he said, smiling that warm, disarming smile. "It is a comfort to know I am in the care of someone so trustworthy. Loyalty is a rare and precious thing, the most valuable quality a person can possess." It was not a compliment, it was a confirmation. He was telling me that he knew he'd tempted me, and he was praising me for resisting. The invisible bars of my cage had just been reinforced. He followed this with a story a few days later, a seemingly random anecdote about a town in Germany where a young woman had been entrusted with a partisan's secret. She had told one person, just one, her beloved brother. The secret had been discovered, and the Gestapo had made an example of the entire family. It was not her fault, of course, Kurt concluded, watching my face intently. She acted out of love, but the road to ruin is so often paved with good intentions. A secret is a burden that cannot be shared, not ever. The threat was unmistakable. A cold blade pressed against the throat of my family. He had seen my wavering, he had sensed my fear, and he was now making it explicitly clear what the cost of my silence was, and what the cost of breaking it would be. Despite my terror, a small, defiant part of me refused to be completely subjugated. I began my own pathetic, clandestine investigation. I needed another piece of the puzzle, another name, another clue to cling to. When he was asleep, his breathing deep and even, I would creep from my room and go not to his, but to the small mudroom where my mother had stored the clothes he'd been wearing when he crashed. They were cleaned and folded in a corner, waiting for his departure. My hands trembling in the darkness, I went through the pockets of his fine wool coat for what felt like the 10th time. I had found nothing before. But this time, my fingers brushed against a small, stiff piece of cardboard I had previously missed, sewn deep into the lining of an inner pocket. It took me several minutes of frantic, silent work with a sewing needle to unpick the threads. Finally, I pulled it free. It was a luggage claim ticket, the kind used for a train. On it was a departure point, Baltimore, and a destination, a small, insignificant town 200 miles south of us that I had never even heard of. It was another lie. He had told me he'd come directly from New York. Why would he lie about something so small? Unless it wasn't small, unless that town held a key to who he was? I had no way of knowing, but it was enough. It was proof that his entire story was a fabrication, from the grand, sweeping lies about his escape from Germany to the tiny, seemingly insignificant details of his journey. I tucked the ticket into my pocket, a dangerous, useless piece of truth, and crept back to my bed, feeling more alone than ever. The growing tension in the house was palpable. My mother and I barely spoke. We moved around each other in a dance of avoidance and resentment. The silence was heavy with unspoken accusations. She knew I was keeping something from her, and I knew she was watching me, waiting for me to break. The breaking point came a week before Kurt finally left. She cornered me in the barn as I was forking hay for the cows. "I cannot do this anymore, Judith," she said, her voice strained and raw. "I do not know who or what is in that room, but he is poisoning this family. He is poisoning you." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my back to her, my voice sullen. "Don't you dare lie to me," she snapped, and the ferocity in her voice made me turn around. "I am your mother. I see what is happening to you. You don't sleep. You barely eat. You walk around this house like a ghost, and your eyes are full of fear. What has he done to you? What hold does he have over you?" "He hasn't done anything," I insisted, my own voice rising to match hers. "He's a good man. He's my friend." "A friend?" she scoffed, a bitter, painful sound. "A friend doesn't turn a daughter against her mother. A friend doesn't fill a house with secrets until the air is too thick to breathe. He is a predator, Judith. And you are so blinded by his stories and his flattery that you cannot see it." Tears of frustration and fear streamed down my face. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to throw myself into her arms and confess about the briefcase, the name, the stolen car, the cruel voice in the night. I wanted her to save me. But Kurt's parable about the girl who betrayed a secret echoed in my mind. The Gestapo had made an example of the entire family. He had put that story in my head for this exact moment, to keep me silent. "You're wrong," I sobbed, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "You're just grieving, and you hate everyone who isn't Dad. You want to be miserable, and you want me to be miserable with you." It was the cruelest thing I had ever said to her. I saw the words land, saw the shock and pain register on her face. It was as if I had physically struck her. She recoiled, her expression crumbling. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the barn, leaving me alone with the cows and the terrible, unforgivable thing I had done. I had severed my last lifeline. I was truly, utterly on my own. A few days later, Kurt announced that he was ready. "The leg is strong enough," he said. "It is time for me to disappear." The night of his departure was dark and moonless. He had a plan, but its details were vague. A contact, a prearranged ride from a crossroads miles away. He dressed in the clothes I had secretly mended for him. He looked like a different person, no longer a patient, but a man of purpose, a man in control. He asked me to walk with him for the first mile, to help him carry his briefcase. My mother stayed in her room, the door firmly shut. We slipped out of the house like thieves in the night. The silence between us was heavy as we walked down the long, dark driveway. At the edge of our property, where the gravel met the paved county road, he stopped. "This is where we part," he said. He turned to me, and in the deep darkness, I could just make out his silhouette. "I will never forget what you have done for me, Judith," he said, his voice a low, sincere murmur. "You saved me in more ways than one. I am in your debt." He reached into his coat pocket. "I want you to have this. A small thing, to remember our time together." He pressed something into my hand. It was made of wood, small and smooth and light. I held it up. It was a small bird, exquisitely carved, every tiny feather detailed with a patient, skillful hand. "I made it for you," he said, "in the long hours. A little bird, to remind you to keep our secrets safe, to keep them nested deep where no one can ever find them." The gift was both a kindness and a final chilling threat, a beautiful cage for the secret he was leaving with me. "One day," he continued, "I will find a way to repay you, a debt of a life for a life. That is a promise." He squeezed my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be paternal but felt proprietary. "Be a good girl, Judith, and be silent." And then he was gone, melting into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, long after the sound of his footsteps had faded, until the cold seeped deep into my bones. The immediate danger, the daily tension of his presence, was gone. But it was replaced by a vast, echoing emptiness, a silence filled with his words, his threats, his secrets. I walked back to the house, the carved bird clutched in my hand. I went to the spare room. It was neat and empty, the bed made, as if he had never been there at all. But the air was still thick with his presence. I felt tainted, as though his secrets had seeped into the very walls of the house, into the very marrow of my bones. He was gone, but he had left his ghost behind. And I was to be its keeper. I sat on the edge of the bed in the silent, empty room, no longer a child, but not yet a woman. I was something else entirely. A secret keeper, a liar, and the unwitting accomplice to a monster whose true face I had not yet even begun to imagine. And in the profound quiet of that room, I had the horrifying premonition that this was not the end of his story. It was just the end of the beginning. The quiet that followed Kurt's departure was a lie. On the surface, life on the farm returned to its familiar, monotonous rhythm. The seasons turned, the chores were done. The years began to stack one on top of the other, like pages in a long, uneventful book. I grew up. I fell in love with a kind, steady man from a neighboring farm named Jerry, a man whose silence was peaceful, not menacing. We married, and he moved into the old farmhouse with my mother and me. In time, the house, once so quiet and heavy with grief, was filled with the noise and life of our own children. First Ronald, then Larry, then our two girls, Joyce and Carol. I became a wife, a mother, the keeper of a home. I buried the memory of Kurt, of the stolen car and the secret briefcase, as deep as I could. I locked it in a cold, dark room in the back of my mind and threw away the key. The small, carved bird he had given me was tucked away in an old jewelry box, a relic from a past that felt more like a fever dream than a memory. My mother and I never spoke of him again. The chasm that had opened between us during his stay never truly closed, but we stitched a fragile peace over it, a truce built on the foundation of a shared, unspoken secret. She passed away peacefully in her sleep when my youngest, Carol, was just a toddler, taking her own quiet suspicions and sorrows with her to the grave. Life went on, The children grew. They were good children, happy and healthy, rooted in the solid, honest soil of the farm. Yet, even in the brightest moments of my life, a child's first steps, a Christmas morning with presents scattered under the tree, a summer picnic by the creek, the shadow of my secret remained. It was a constant low-grade hum of fear beneath the surface of my happiness, a feeling that the past was not truly past, that a debt was still owed. The bill came due on a crisp autumn morning in the early 1980s. My children were mostly grown, Ronald already in college, and I was a woman in my early 40s, my life settled and predictable. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where my mother had once confronted me, sipping my morning coffee and idly flipping through the newspaper Jerry had brought back from town the day before. My eyes scanned the headlines without much interest until a small article, buried deep in the international section, snagged my attention. The headline read, "Long-hunted Nazi war criminal arrested in Argentina." Beneath it was a grainy, black-and-white photograph of an old man, flanked by two uniformed police officers. He was stooped and wrinkled, his face a roadmap of age. But I knew him. I knew him in an instant, in a way that defied time and logic. It wasn't the features I recognized, it was the presence behind them. It was the cold, appraising intelligence in his eyes. It was Kurt. The ceramic coffee cup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the linoleum floor, the dark liquid splashing across my shoes. I didn't notice. I couldn't move. My entire world, the stable, happy life I had so carefully constructed, tilted and began to collapse. The article named him Kurt Steiner, a former SS doctor at the Mauthausen concentration camp, known by his victims as the Angel of Death. He was wanted for performing sadistic medical experiments, primarily on children. The man who had praised my healer's hands had used his own to torture the innocent. I felt a violent wave of nausea. I had harbored a monster. I had fed him, cared for him, protected him, and defended him against my own mother. I had been his willing, foolish accomplice, but as I read on, my trembling hands barely able to hold the paper steady, the initial horror gave way to something infinitely worse, a level of terror so profound it seemed to stop my heart. The article mentioned that before fleeing to South America in the early 60s, Steiner was believed to have spent several years hiding in the United States under a pseudonym, working, incredibly, as a pediatrician. A cold, metallic dread, sharper and more terrifying than any I had ever known, began to crawl up my spine. My mind flashed back to my own children's youth, to the kindly town doctor who had made house calls in the dead of night. The man with the faint German accent whom he explained away by saying he was from an immigrant family in the Dakotas. The man all the mothers in town trusted implicitly. The man whose waiting room walls were covered with the smiling photos of his young patients, including all 4 of my own children. A man named Dr. Frederick Miller. "No," I whispered, the sound a strangled gasp in the silent kitchen. "Oh, dear God, no." The 2 nightmares, the one from my past and the one from my children's, merged into a single, unbearable reality. The name from the briefcase tag, the alias he had so smoothly explained away, was real. He hadn't fled to Canada. He had stayed. He had come here. He had found us. The promise he had made on that dark road, a debt of a life for a life, echoed in my mind, its meaning now hideously, monstrously clear. He had repaid my saving his life by insinuating himself into my own, by laying his blood-stained hands on my children. Over the next few days, I lived in a waking nightmare, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle I had been too terrified to solve. I pulled out old photo albums. There he was, Dr. Miller, a smiling, benevolent figure in the background of a school play, at a town picnic, even at my daughter Joyce's baptism, always there, always watching. I found a photo of Ronald's second-grade class and a memory, sharp and sickening, pierced through the fog of years. Ronald had gone through a difficult phase as a young boy, nightmares, anxiety, a sudden fear of the dark. And Dr. Miller had been so helpful, so understanding. He'd suggested private counseling sessions to help Ronald work through his fears. For months, Jerry had taken him to the doctor's office once a week, and the problems had, eventually, gone away. With a heart full of cold dread, I knew I had to talk to Ronald. When he came home from college for the weekend, I asked him to take a walk with me. I took him to the woods, to the very path where I had once carried a briefcase of lies. I asked him, my voice trembling, if he remembered Dr. Miller. A guarded look came over my son's face. "Yeah, I remember him," he said. "Why?" "I need you to tell me what happened in those private sessions, honey," I said, my voice gentle but insistent. "I need you to tell me what he did." At first, he resisted. But then, seeing the raw desperation in my eyes, the story came tumbling out. He told me of the mind games the doctor used to play. He'd show Ronald and his friend Wayne, a boy who lived down the road and looked so much like Ronald they were often mistaken for brothers, pictures. They started as simple images, but gradually became more and more disturbing. He'd ask them questions about fear, about loyalty, about pain. He told them a story about a boy who betrayed his family's secret and asked Ronald what the right punishment would be. He was continuing his work. He was studying them, comparing their reactions, just as he had with the twins in the camps. He was using my son, my beautiful, innocent boy, as a lab rat in his decades-long experiment. The full, devastating truth came out weeks later. Investigators working on the Steiner case, alerted by my testimony about his time in our town, contacted me. They had recovered journals and records from Mauthausen. They sat with me in my own kitchen and told me the final missing piece of the story. My father, James, had not been killed in action. He was captured and sent to Mauthausen. For months he resisted their interrogations, a man of uncommon strength and resilience. His lead interrogator, the doctor who personally oversaw the brutal experiments designed to break him, the man who ultimately killed him, was Kurt Steiner. He knew. From the moment he opened his eyes in my kitchen, he knew exactly who I was. His crash, his arrival, it was all a deliberate, calculated act of diabolical cruelty. He had sought out the daughter of the man he couldn't break to begin the second phase of his experiment. The trial was held in Germany. I went alone. I needed to see him, to face him, one last time. When he was led into the courtroom, our eyes met across the sterile room. He was a frail old man, but in his eyes, I saw no remorse. I saw a flicker of triumph. He saw me as the final, successful chapter of his greatest work. I took the stand and told my story. I spoke of the girl in the snowstorm, the lies, the fear, and the pediatrician who had violated the most sacred trust. I spoke for my son, Ronald, and I spoke for the father I barely remembered, the man whose strength had been a curse. Throughout my testimony, he watched me, a small, knowing smirk on his lips. When it was his turn to speak, he confessed everything with a chilling, academic pride. "The resilience of the subject, James," he said, referring to my father, "was remarkable. My hypothesis was to see if such psychological fortitude was hereditary. I designed a multi-generational case study. The daughter, Judith, the grandson, Ronald. The results were fascinating, a testament to my life's work. He had won. He had turned my family's deepest trauma and greatest strength into a footnote in his monstrous legacy. The court sentenced him to hang, but he cheated the world of that justice. He took his own life in his cell that night, a final act of control. I returned home, not to a life of peace, but to a family that now had to live with the full scope of this horror. The secret was out, and its ugliness touched all of us. But a strange thing happened. The truth, as terrible as it was, did not break us. It bound us together. My children, my husband, We talked. We shared the pain. We found my father's story not in a monster's journal, but in our own lives. We saw his resilience in Ronald's quiet strength, in my daughter's compassion, in my son Larry's unwavering loyalty. Steiner had thought he was studying my father's legacy, but he had never understood it. My father's legacy wasn't just resilience, it was love. And that was something Steiner could observe, but never, ever touch. We began to heal. It was a slow and painful process, like setting a badly broken bone. But we did it together. We learned that we were not defined by the evil that had been done to us, but by how we chose to live in its aftermath. We chose to live with love, with honesty, and with a strength that was passed down to us from a good man we barely knew, but whose courage lived on in our veins. We had survived the monster, not by forgetting, but by remembering what truly made us strong. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please, share it, because who knows? Maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the curtain of my heart for listening to me.